The one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I among you but I am among you as the one who serves. You can if you trace the biblical thinking about young and old throughout the Bible. One of the basic sort of tasks of the young is to listen to the old. Uh, I, I was not on this particular trip to Africa, but some of my friends were on a trip in the Congo, and there was a young man who kind of had a little too full of himself, and he was really young, like maybe 22 or something like that. He was telling all the older. He was an American guy, and he was telling all these older Zambian men what to do, and that's like a huge no-no at multiple levels. And one of the older Zambian men said, "Who saw the moon first, me or you?" And that was his way of saying, I'm older than you. You need to be respectful. I know that we have a Filipino friend who told us that, no, not Filipino, Korean, that like one of the first things you do in her culture is to like determine how old someone is, if it's questionable about whether they're older than you or not. Because if they're older than you, then there's a certain deference that you have to pay. And so, like, one of the early questions you ask, it's not rude in that culture to ask, for a woman to ask another woman, "How old are you?" It's like, I need to know which side of the flow chart to work here. If you're older than me, then that means I have to give deference and so forth. So, in the scriptures, one of the classic moments of that is in Job chapter 32. Job has three friends, and the two of them take up most of the conversation with Job, so that it appears for 32 chapters that it's a dialogue between three people, Job and his two friends. But there's a young man who's been there all along, and his name's Elihu. And Elihu actually has the answer. He actually has the answer, and he has waited 32 chapters to speak. And actually, after he does speak, God shows up and says, Elihu was right. But when he waits 32 chapters at the beginning of Job 32, he actually says, I waited because you are older than I am. And I assumed that wisdom dwells with age. And then he says, basically, I assumed wrong. And then he says, like, Job, you're wrong. Well, the reason why he has the answer is he says, Job, you're wrong, and you guys are wrong too. And you guys are just asking all of this the wrong way. And then God shows up and responds. So the reason why I bring all that up, the deference for the age thing, and the key function of the age honoring in the Bible is the younger listens to the older, right? And the reason why I bring that up is because when Jesus defines greatness, he says in verse 26 of Luke 22, but not so with you, rather let the greatest among you be as the youngest. And so what I think Jesus is saying there is that be a listener. One of the functions of being the youngest in a situation is to be slow to speak and quick to listen. And in fact, later he says, be like the one who serves. The leader should be as one who serves. Well, even in that dynamic of servant and leader, or servant and master, the servant's the one who listens. It's not the one who speaks. In our discussion about biblical communication, we're going to continue talking about listening. And we have this idea that it is the proper role of a humble person to be a listening person. Okay, so I want you to look at Proverbs 20 verse 5, and also Proverbs 10:23. So if someone could read Proverbs 10:23 first, and then someone else read Proverbs 25. So Proverbs 10:23, somebody, and Proverbs 25, somebody. Cool. Okay. Doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom is the pleasure of the man of understanding. The NASB, that can usually is the most reliable, most accurate. It says, doing evil or doing wrong is a sport to the fool, as is wisdom to the man of understanding. So this is a parallel verse where it basically says, like, doing wrong is like fun or enjoyable for the fool, and seeking wisdom is fun or enjoyable to the man of understanding. So like it's like I like the NASB there because it actually kind of says like seeking wisdom is to the man of understanding like a sport. It's like a pleasurable vocation. It's like enjoyable to seek wisdom. Okay, so now look at somebody read Proverbs 25. Okay, so there are about 10 proverbs that use the phrase "the man of understanding," and among these 10 proverbs, there's just this sort of description of what this man of understanding is. And the first characteristic is that he enjoys wisdom. He enjoys wisdom like a sinner enjoys sin. He enjoys wisdom like a fool enjoys folly. And because he enjoys wisdom, he employs active listening. That's the idea. And these notes are in Basecamp, by the way, in the head HQ message board. So, but because the man of wisdom enjoys wisdom, because the man of understanding enjoys wisdom, he listens in a certain way. And the way he listens is described in Proverbs 25. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So what do you guys think that verse means? The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Any thoughts? What a person is really thinking, motivated by is deeper. Good. Good. Yeah. 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 That's good. Um, any other thoughts? So all that was said there is really helpful, and the idea, like was mentioned, is that there's more going on than meets the eye. In biblical counseling, you can hear. Can you just turn the subwoofer off? I know I'm getting feedback from the speakers, but I don't know. Okay, okay. Um, probably. I'm just gonna get up on the stage. It'll fix the problem. There we go. So there's more than meets the eye. There's something deeper going on. Can someone read Proverbs 20, verse 6? So the next verse. Okay, so just in the next verse from Proverbs 25, you have the example of someone proclaiming that they have steadfast love, but they're not. They don't really have steadfast love. They're saying one thing, but they're doing another. So people are complicated, and people are not only complicated to us, but they're complicated to themselves. And so this man of understanding figure has a way of drawing out what's really going on deep in the heart. And when these man of understanding passages show up in Proverbs, they're basically, remember, the purpose of Proverbs is to commend wisdom. It's to encourage people to seek wisdom. So these man of understanding passages are sort of like references to you saying, look what a man of understanding can do. Or look how a man understanding acts under pressure, and so on and so forth. So this man of understanding, he hears what people say, but he asks the right questions and goes deeper to actually know kind of what is actually going on below the surface. So there are a bunch of, if you have that Basecamp document open, there are a bunch of quotes from commentators about this verse. And I won't read all of those. The basic idea of these commentators, that it's a helpful reminder, is just that this verse does not mean that there is treasure deep in a man's heart and that we go dig for it. It means that there's stuff deep in a person's heart. It could be bad, it could be good. Kidner, who is, I think, the go-to guy, commentator on Proverbs, he says, it is foreign to the thought of Proverbs to gather from this that every man has an inner reservoir of wisdom, and the wise man is simply the man who can draw upon it. Now, this would be the idea of therapy, though, correct? This would be the idea of talk therapy and so forth, is to is to help someone discover the deep thing that is the truest thing, to help someone discover their hidden truth or their inner truth or so on and so forth. It's certainly one mode of therapy that's very popular is to sort of like I'm going to get you to talking, and the truth that you know deep down inside will come out. And so that's not what this proverb's saying. This proverb's not assuming there's truth deep down there. It's just assuming there's something deep down there. And that something is described as a man's purpose. And purpose there just means motivation, secret, deepest desire, and so forth. John Gill, this is going to come across in a bit of an antiquated language, but he describes it as this way: pure and undisturbed, but secret, hidden, and hard to be come at. Such are the things of the spirit of a man, the thoughts of a man, the devices of his heart, which though easily known by the searcher of hearts, are not easily penetrated into by men, or does not easily go out of them that is in them, especially in some men who are closed and reserved. This is true of wicked men, who seek deep to hide their counsel, and of good men, especially studious men, who have got a great deal of wisdom and knowledge in them, but are not very communicative, being slow of speech and silent in conversation. Well, a man of understanding can just like deal with a person and help that person, or help and figure out what's going on inside of that person. But really what we want to talk about tonight is a ministry of understanding. So in one sense, that verse can like say, boy, it'd be really good to be a man of understanding. But in another way, this verse, like a lot of those man of understanding verses in Proverbs, also says it'd be really good to know a man of understanding. It'd be really good to have someone like this in your life, or if you have something you want to talk to, this is the person you want to go talk to about this thing. In Proverbs 28:2, there's a beautiful verse that just says, like, you know, a nation that is run by a man of understanding is at peace. It's another one of these man of understanding passages. So it's saying he's a good leader, and this verse is really saying he's a good listener, right? He's saying this man of understanding is the person you want to talk to when you really want to figure out what's going on deep inside of your heart. So this is basically someone who is really good at listening and asking questions, right? You know, I've preached a lot of sermons and I've heard a lot of sermons, and I've been in the position where I'll hear somebody say something about a text that I never thought of myself. And I'm sure you've been in that position too, where you hear someone make a discovery, a preacher say something about a passage. You're like, I never would have seen that. I never would have thought of that, so on. And when people tell me that, I always think, well, that's not quite true. Like, the truth is that I saw that because I spent a ton of time looking at it, right? And most people don't have that much time to look at something. But what's interesting is that it's sort of an illustration of how this principle of the man of understanding works is you see things that are deeper than visible. You see things that aren't immediately evident the longer you pay attention. So in many respects, what we do on Sunday mornings is we have a person get up behind this pulpit who has devoted themselves to listening to God's word that week in a way that was sort of for all of us, and then condensing what they heard in that listening into something that is, you know, a highly concentrated version, or like a soup, a reduction, you know, like you reduce a sauce. Like here's 30 hours of listening to this text reduced into 30 minutes. You know, it's concentrate. But what's interesting about that is I really have a heart, and I don't know where this will go in long term, but I've always just had a heart for helping men kind of step into ministry and be sustained into ministry. And I've thought a lot about this, like what keeps a pastor going back week after week and spending 20 hours listening to a text. And the truth is that he only does that. He might do that for a few years because he's paid to do it. Eventually, he only does that because he loves to do it. You know, the listening, the deep listening is always a function of love. We listen, the thing that we love, we listen to closely and sincerely. And you can think about what like a sermon is sort of like this person loves the word so much that they're willing to like spend their life in it. And then they love the people that they're going to share it with. And so there's just love all around this idea. And that's the main idea with listening is biblical listening requires so deep attention that it really can only be motivated by love. I think this is something that maybe should convict us all, but it's not uncommon to be in a conversation with someone who simply obviously loves themselves more than they love anything else. And it shows up that they simply are not paying attention. They simply don't pay attention. They are full of their own preoccupations. They're full of their own sensory involvements. They're not disciplining themselves to listen. They are legitimately in that moment, like just demonstrating, I love myself. And if you've ever been around someone who's just a terrible listener, it's unfortunate, but that's often the case. To boil it down, they simply have not realized, oh, wait a minute, if I loved this person, I would listen to them, because that's what God does when he loves us. So this ministry of understanding that I hope we all aspire to be this man or woman of understanding, it really is rooted in both the love of listening to God, but also the love of listening to others. And the idea that we have in mind this evening is to just say, okay, how can we be people like this man of understanding for those that are closest to us, for those in our church, for our spouses, for our friends? How can we be this person? And the other piece of it is just to see how important this kind of person is. You know, the real premise of this verse, so far as we're talking about a ministry of understanding, is this. If you are wise, you will not trust your own self-take on whatever. If you are wise, you will not trust that you even know yourself especially well. If you're wise, you'll sort of be like, okay, I've got a bunch of stuff going on in my heart. I think I know some of it. I think I don't know some of it, and I need help. And I need somebody to help me sort this stuff out. I need someone to draw out the deep purposes of my heart like a person draws water out of a well. And honestly, this is probably one of the main reasons why it just makes sense to have Christian friends and to keep those Christian friendships healthy and to maintain them and so forth is, you know, I hope you're aware of this. Like, it gets very confusing and full of nonsense in here. And who's helping you sort all that out? Who's helping you make sense of it? Who's helping you tell the truth between the lies and even just like between the half-truths and the truths and so on and so forth? You need a man of understanding in your life. You need a woman of understanding. You need people in your life that listen and help you make sense of what's actually going on in your heart. So let's just talk about kind of how to do that. And this will be kind of, part one, we introduced this concept of listening and said, God does it. God really does it. And now we're sort of like, well, how do we do it? How do we listen to one another well? So looking back at that verse, we can pull some more out of this verse. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So, you won't find any verse in the Bible that says, here's how you draw water out of a well. And that's because the goal carries the methodological implications with it. So if the goal is there's water in here and I need to get the water out, then you figure out how to do that, but the goal will kind of point you to how to do it. Well, likewise, it's really interesting how this verse just gets dropped on us. Proverbs 25 just gets dropped on us. It says, a man of understanding draws out the deep purposes of a person's heart, but doesn't tell you how to do it. And I think that's because a lot of things are different. Many things are different in each situation, but also because, like with water, if the goal is simply, I need to help this person see what's really going on deep down inside of them, well then that's gonna inform your methodology, and you're gonna think about, okay, how do I do this? So I've included a number of quotes. I think I'm gonna skip them right now and come back to them later, but just dealing with the methodology of listening, because I just kind of want to stay close to the text for a minute. So the first thing that maybe would be helpful is to remember that here people's thoughts are referred to as water. People's deep thoughts are referred to as water. Now, why is that relevant? Well, because this is a culture that lived hand to mouth with water. This is a culture that had a reverence for water and wells. You know, it's like this is a culture that valued that valued water greatly. So when this proverb says a person's heart or a person's deep thoughts is like water, what does that tell you? How should you be thinking about other people's deep thoughts? Kind of rhetorical, but could someone answer it? It's valuable, yeah. So the first thing is just that piece there. People's deep thoughts are, now, I think the way to think about this is they might not be right, but they matter. They're important. So that's the beginning of this whole idea, is just let's stay in the cultural context and say, when these people heard about a well, they're like, oh, there's only 6 of those in our entire country. I don't think that's right. But you get what I'm saying. Like water scarcity is a pronounced thing. And so when you start using this phrase, a person's inner thoughts, their deepest purposes are like water, it's like, okay, water matters. Water's important. Secondly, it begins as we stick with the well analogy, it begins to point us in a direction of methodology. Because then you sort of like, well, what's the thing I get the water out with in this metaphor? And the answer is, I think the answer is questions. Now, not all questions are created equal. There are such a thing as dumb questions. Think about it this way. This is so helpful when talking to teenagers. It's really hard, though. It's helpful. I'm going to make it sound like it's helpful, but it's actually so hard to do. But, okay, so here's the idea. If you ask an open-ended question, it's like using a big bucket, right? You can get more water in it. But if you ask a yes-no question, it's like a shot glass. It's like you're not getting much water out of that. So our bucket tool is our questions, but not all questions are created equal. And the trick is to figure out questions that get you as much water as possible. And that's so hard to do. That's why I'm saying, like, well, here's the trick. Let's just do this. Yeah, that's the trick, but that's difficult to do. So it's like, how was your day? And the answer is fine. It's like, could I have used a different bucket there to get a better answer? David Mathis wrote an article that was essentially a review of Bonhoeffer's Life Together. In Bonhoeffer's Life Together, he has a whole chapter on listening. And David Mathis says, good listening asks perceptive, open-ended questions that don't tee up yes, no answers, but gently peel the onion and probe beneath the surface. It watches carefully for nonverbal communication, but doesn't interrogate and pry into details the speaker doesn't want to share, but meekly draws them out and helps point the speaker to fresh perspectives through careful but genuine questions. So not all buckets are created equal. Not all questions are created equal. But what I think you'll find is that asking good questions is a learned behavior. And if you just decide, like, I want to get better at this, I'm going to pay attention to the questions I ask, I think you will probably find that the Lord will help you there. I think that the idea there from a spiritual perspective is just to actually pray to the Lord and just say, God, what can I ask them that will actually be helpful right now? So I'm going to talk about some ways to mess that up in a minute. But let's talk more about this concept of draw. So he draws it out. The man of understanding draws it out. Well, I think the first idea there is just that's work. That's work. Listening is work. Biblical listening should not be something you walk away from thinking, oh, that was entirely just a piece of cake. Like biblical listening in which you are actually locked in and you, as Bonhoeffer says, listening with both ears and really paying attention, that's work. And so one of the things you might ask yourself in a conversation is, am I being a man of understanding? It's like, well, does this feel like work to you? Because it should. It should feel like actually paying attention. And of course, we're all becoming so ADD that we actually feel this when this muscle gets flexed. We actually feel it when we're actually trying to pay attention, because we're also pathetic in that regard. So it's work. It's difficult. It's a labor of love. It's also a skill, and by skill I mostly mean care. So if we go to our metaphor of we're drawing water out of a well, you can do that in a way which is totally self-defeating. How would it be self-defeating to pull a bucket out of a well? Your bucket has a hole in it, yes. I wonder what that would be. I don't have a metaphor. I don't have a part of that, so I don't know what I should do with that. But I'm thinking mostly here of gentleness. So there's a combination of speed, but also herky-jerky. What's the bucket going to do? Slam up against the walls, and you and you get your bucket to the top, and there's only a little water left in it. Questions need to be, listening needs to be a thing of work, of skill, and of care. I call it herky-jerky bucket hoisting. Like you're just going to wind up with a empty bucket. So when you're asking questions, there is like a fair degree of gentleness involved. There's a fair degree of care involved as well. And then the word deep. A man's purposes are deep water. Now, what does that tell you about listening? Well, it tells me that a deeper well takes a longer time to get to. One of the key principles that we discussed last week, I believe the key in biblical listening, is time. You have to give people a lot of time. There's a book that I was glancing at this week on marriage and divorce, and the writer Andrew Korns, he's talking about how to pastorally or just as church members care for people in those situations. And he says, we should not imagine for a moment that everything is going to be sorted out after just one conversation. Indeed, it may very well be that you have only been told part of the story, more particularly if you have taken the initiative, encouraged a friend to talk, or you're a professional, clergy or counselor, and are not already known and trusted, or if one of the marriage partners is unwilling, so on and so forth. But even when there is no reluctance to speak, perhaps especially then, the Christian friend will need great patience. He will often need to listen and listen and listen again, frequently to the same stories and the same emotions as they are gone over 100 times. This in itself is an invaluable ministry. In less serious cases, boy, I've seen this so many times, all that is sometimes needed is a listening, sympathetic ear, and this alone gives fresh courage to go back into the marriage and continue trying to make it work. Here's a great example of that, and it's not marriage related. Your spouse comes home, and they're ticked off because their boss isn't listening to them. You would be shocked by how helpful it is just to listen to them, and how you can sort of be the stand-in for the person that should be listening to them, because it scratches the itch. They're like, I need someone to actually act like I matter for a minute, and you can just be that person for them and say, well, I'll listen to you. And then they're like, okay, I'm okay now, and I can move on a little bit further. Happens in marriage counseling a lot too. Okay, so the deeper the well, the longer the time. Let's just say that we just need to have a clear sense that listening is always a work of patience. Let's talk about mistakes to avoid. First mistake to avoid, and I don't think this is a comprehensive list, but the first mistake to avoid is a failure to exhibit extended commitment. And what I mean by that is it just needs to be clear going in to this relationship, whatever that relationship is we may not have all the time in the world for this one talk, but we do have plenty of time to come back and have another talk, and another talk, and another talk, and another talk. When people feel like they're in a hurry, they speak worse and they communicate less effectively, and it actually makes the process less efficient and slower, and you're actually getting less information. So there's a phrase in the special forces that says slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Well, if you slow down someone speaking and you help them to understand, you don't have to cram everything you need to say in this hour, because we can have another hour next week and another hour the next week, another hour the next week. What you're doing when you slow them down is you're actually speeding them up in terms of communicating, because they become less harried and more thoughtful, and they take the necessary gaps to think, and so on and so forth. So one of the big mistakes we make, even when we're trying to be helpful, is we fail to just let people know. People always assume that they are imposing, and that's just not true. If you're a man of understanding or a woman of understanding, this kind of thing, listening to someone, is part of what you enjoy. It's part of your thing. It's work, but you enjoy it. So people are always assuming that they've got to fit a 10-year, let's say, divorce saga into an hour-long conversation. It's like, no, we're not gonna get anywhere with that. Like, I'm gonna know your favorite color at the end of this hour. Like, it's gonna take some time for you to really talk, and that's okay. So one of the first failures you see is just a failure to say, hey, this is a deep well. We got a lot of rope. It's gonna take some time, and that's okay. The second is a failure to anticipate the liking element of a conversation. So in biblical counseling, we have this phrase called the intentionally helpful conversation. And I love that phrase to death. And all it means is you make an appointment with a friend to talk about a particular thing. In other words, not, hey, let's just catch up. Hey, let's just hang out. Like, I have this thing I want to talk about. Can we go talk about that thing? And the thing that does is it just advances intentionality to the front, and it's beautiful. I really highly recommend it. One of the things that can get in the way of intentionality in conversation is something that sociologists refer to as the liking element of conversations. So people started doing research on this, and they discovered that people have conversations to accomplish basically two goals. One is to share information, which is what we're talking about, and two is to manage impressions, to make people like you. Okay. So the impression management part of a conversation, especially when someone's talking about their problems, this can get really bad and really ugly and really tedious really fast. And here's what I mean. Someone wants to talk about a problem they're having, or they're just wanting to talk about something they're struggling with. If they have had bad experiences in churches, if they themselves are judgmental, they will stop every 3 sentences and qualify, well, I mean, it wasn't as bad as it sounds, or, well, I was actually this, or so on and so forth. And what they're doing is they're trying to do two things at the same time. They're trying to convey information and manage impressions. They're trying to be likable and communicate information. And this gets very tedious. It's really, feel bad for the person, because you're like, you don't need to like, I'm here. Like, you don't need to do that. So one of the mistakes we can make in having intentionally helpful conversations is, I think it's very helpful on the front end just to say, hey, I just want to be clear, like, I'm here because I love you, because I want to help you, and so on. And also, I'm a total depravity guy, so I know lots of people. We've all really sinned in terrible ways, and so on. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But at some point, this tendency for someone who is stuck in impression management mode, you will have to actually correct that. And you'll actually have to say, hey, you tend to qualify things a lot, or apologize for this or that. It's like, let's just talk. Let's just move past that. I promise. Like, I'll let everything come on the table before I think anything. Can we just talk and you not try to manage my sense of you? Hopefully you can do that in a passive way where you don't actually have to call it out, just through affirmation on the front end. But it can become a serious ball and chain in intentionally helpful conversations. Third mistake to avoid is just asking non-essential questions. So it's just very easy to get distracted. And like, for instance, if someone says, I saw this pretty girl at a barbecue shop the other day, at a barbecue store the other day, and like I kind of lusted after her in my heart. Don't ask which barbecue place was it, like like which honestly like you probably do want to know because you're from Kansas City, but yeah, yeah, you're probably curious. But like it's hard to do this, especially when you're just friends with the person and so on. But try to have a sense and understanding of, I can ask that question later, but like I want to like really work at letting this person feel heard at a deep level and helping them see what's going on in their heart, so on and so forth. There's one exception to that, and that is just people are sometimes reserved on the front end, so sometimes you have to prime the pump and ask those kinds of questions just to kind of start the process. It's just hard to get off of small talk once you get there. Another mistake that people make is to ask the hardest questions first. So people tend to hold the darkest stuff till last, and that may be evasion, or it might just be kind of a feeling out process to see, like, can I trust you? And that's okay. So it can be helpful just to ask a few innocuous questions on the front end and just sort of acclimate the person to answering questions. But you just have to have a sense of where your relationship is. Asking a really hard question on the front end can be pretty brutal if I don't trust you, if I don't know you, and so on. And then it's sort of like, if I don't want to answer this question, am I being evasive? It's like, probably not, but I wouldn't feel that in real time. I'd be worried about being seen as being evasive when I might just say, like, who are you? I don't know you that well. Why are you asking me this question? So we can make that mistake. Another mistake to make is just over-identification, and this one's super common, and it's become much more common in the last 10 years as empathy has continued to be a high point in values, and that is just this sense of when someone's sharing, we have a tendency to say, oh, I had something like that happen to me. And darn it, it's almost always meant to be empathetic and encouraging, but it can really quickly make the conversation about you. If the person is polite, they might feel like they have to ask follow-up questions about your story, and now we're talking about you instead. And so these are usually pretty counterproductive, even though they're almost always well-intentioned. I don't think that most of the time people do this because they want to talk about themselves. I think most of the time people are doing this because they're trying to say, like, we have solidarity, we have camaraderie, look, we have the same experiences, and so on. I would say 9 times out of 10, that turns out to not be a useful way of drawing somebody out. And there's one exception, though. When someone is really feeling ashamed, I think that's a good time to step in and talk about your own sin. But I would probably leave it for that. When someone's feeling when the shame vibes are coming on strong, then I'd be like, okay, let me meet you there and help cover you a little bit right now. But otherwise, I'm one of the things as I'm reading through all this, I'm like, I probably make all these mistakes with you guys. But these are things that we all have to work on. Another mistake is just avoiding the hard questions altogether. You can get a sense that there's this one question that still needs to be asked, but it hasn't been asked because it's like the most icky of all the questions. And you really need to go ahead and ask that question. And it can be the last question for that day, or it could be the next question of the next time or something, but at some point the hard questions have to be asked. Another mistake people make is expecting linear and orderly retelling. So people do not give information about a complicated heart affair in an organized and linear way, guys. So if they had it all organized, they wouldn't need your help. So I think the way to think about this is is to go back to Proverbs 20, verse 5, and let's replace water with puzzle pieces, because this is what it's really more like. And I'm pulling a bucket of puzzle pieces up at a time, and we're putting them out on the table, and we're making sense of this together in the open. It's if you will get confused. People tend to remember things based on emotional impact, and there are all sorts of other things. So they're giving you very snapshots, and you're going to have to go through the story multiple times to get enough snapshots to actually kind of understand what really is going on. If you expect people to give you kind of this linear progression of events, all you're going to get is their well-rehearsed version that is full of either lies or deceptions or mistruths or so on and so forth. So it's better to assemble the detective bulletin board of all the snapshots and then pull the strings together. It's better to do that anyway, because you'll actually get a clearer sense of what's going on. Biggest mistake of all, for sure, is if you are a man or woman of understanding, you got two jobs. You got the job of helping draw water out of this person's heart, but there's a second job you have, and it's the one we mistake the most, and that is you never want to fail to regularly draw water from the Savior's heart in that conversation. It's pretty beautiful, actually. It's sort of like we're helping someone, and we're just pulling stuff out of their heart, and it's like more sludge and so on. It's like, oh, there's some nice water, good, and just walking through this, and then but it's kind of sad. See, the thing is that no matter how orthodox a person's understanding of total depravity or indwelling sin, people are seldom prepared to find how poisoned their well is. Sin shouldn't surprise us, but it almost always does. Sin in our hearts shouldn't surprise us, but it almost always does. And you have to remember, the contents of the well, that's that person. That's the essential them. And so when you're helping someone sort something out and there's stuff coming out and it's not necessarily pretty, it's not necessarily great, well, on the one thing, you really are helping them. But what's the end game? Well, here's the other thing you have. This is wonderful. It's it doesn't have to be every conversation, but every once in a while, I remember I had someone that I talked to, and I just said, okay, I'm done for today. I want to be done talking about your problems, and it's not because I don't like you or anything. It's I want you to be done talking about your problems today. I was like, let's talk about Christ, and let's pull water out of that well and see what we get. And it's this amazing relief, because suddenly everything we pull out of that well is clean and beautiful and true and noble and just and perfect and so on. And this is huge in if you have a marriage situation there's some tension there and so on and so forth. There's only so much fellow, you got your hand on her rope and bucket, and she's got her hand on your rope and bucket, and you guys are maybe adversarially pulling things out. It's just stop after a while. It'll be there tomorrow. You don't have to solve the thing. Here's all you had to do to diffuse the thing. Just take a moment and just worship Jesus together. Just praise what's in him. Praise the deep intentions of his heart. And that's the biggest mistake we all make when it comes to listening, is we forget that we have another well. And if a person ever leaves a conversation thinking that it's their well that matters most, we've failed. Because the joy of the gospel is that their well doesn't matter most. Jesus' well matters the most. And so that's, again, this isn't something that you have to formulaically build into every conversation, but you should sense at times when it's okay, can we just stop for a second and remind ourselves of a couple things? Your sins have been forgiven. Jesus loves you. He shed his precious blood for you. No one will be able to snatch you from his hand. He's the author and perfecter of your faith, so on and so forth. That's the biggest thing that I think separates a man of understanding from a man of God, of Christian understanding, is A lot of people have discernment to help other people figure out what's going on inside them. What good is that if you don't know what's going on inside of Christ? That's the much better story. That's the much more important story. And hopefully, by the way, as you are listening, you're showing the heart of Christ in the way that you're listening, in the way that you're interacting, and so on. Well, I want to conclude my piece of this just by talking about deep listening as a job to be looked after. So a couple of illustrations. One, my wife doesn't know about. She's going to get mad at me. So I had this credit card. I don't remember why I had it, but I had like a subscription and a few things on there. And I think it got switched onto our Amazon account a couple times. And we do pump a fair amount of money through our Amazon account. Anyway, I when I set that credit card up, I do what I always do. I click the pay balance button, auto pay balance. And I don't look at it again. I only have one credit card I actually look at. That's the one I use for like church expenses and so on and so forth. So after probably a year, I thought, I better check on that credit card. I want to see how many points I've accrued, so on. So this is like last week. I click on it, and I had not clicked pay balance. I had clicked pay minimum payment. Most months that was the same number, but some months it wasn't. So at the end of like a year, I'd paid, guys, it wasn't a substantial amount in interest because the balance was so low. But I mean, it was probably $150 for a year of like just stupid. The money was there to pay it. And I just clicked the wrong button. And it's like, well, in your relationships, that is, I think, so helpful in the sense of you hear a lot, you have surface conversations, but those are kind of minimum payment kinds of conversations. And just because we're busy and life is hard and so on, we tend to get in ruts where all of our conversations with the people that are the closest to us are pay the minimum conversations. And the thing to remember is that is going to eventually come back on you. That's not going to work. You need to have some pay balance conversations. And those, because of especially with your closest people, your closest friends and so forth, those sometimes just need to be built in as we just need to have a day or whatever. We had a pay balance conversation going up back and forth to Des Moines, and then we almost died, so whatever. But you just have to have those conversations that are not, I'm going to pay the minimum. That is so easy to do with people we actually do love. And we just pay the minimum, pay the minimum, pay the minimum, pay the minimum. And then one day we're like, wait, why is there this huge issue? Well, because you've been paying the minimum, you big dummy. Another way to think about this is just that deep listening should just be a list of jobs to be done, like brushing your teeth and washing the dishes and taking out the trash. It should just, at the end of the week, you should ask yourself, who did I listen to? Who did I listen to? And you should kind of just understand that the difficulty is that if you don't take out the trash, you get instant feedback. If you don't wash the dishes, you get pretty close to immediate feedback. But if you don't listen to someone who loves you and needs you to listen to them, you don't get immediate feedback. It just builds and builds and builds and builds. And so this sense of we all have people that we need to listen to, and we all have people that need to listen to us. And we've got to kind of think of this more like, this is just a part of what it means to maintain my life. I brush my teeth, I take showers, I take out the trash, I pay my bills, unless you're me, and I listen. And there are some people who need to be able to count on me to be this listener for them. The Bible teaches really clearly that, Paul says this in Romans 16, that every church member has the capacity to be this person for other church members. This is something everybody should aspire to. It is massively helpful. So that's all I've got. Any thoughts or questions? How did you feel when that happened? So on. And like big one for me is because I will do this a lot accidentally. Is like I have to go out of my way to say, "Am I putting words in your mouth?" Because I will put words in like so. so I will tell them, "You think this." uh, so I have to ask, like, is that fair? I had a couple conversations this last week and had to kind of say, like, am I hearing what you're saying? That's probably another one for me. Is like, am I understanding this correctly? So on. I had a conversation with a friend from years ago this week about something kind of tough in his life, and I asked, I remembered to ask toward the end of the conversation, is there anything else that I should know? Because I've said that to one of my children. It's like, is there anything you're not telling me right now that would make your life better if you told me? It's not the it's not the females in the room. So, any other thoughts or questions? Yeah. I love that. I think that the man of understanding is a student. That's his choice in life is to be a student. And I read a quote today that said, "Interesting people are interested in people," and I thought that's absolutely right. Yeah. I love that idea of being a student. I think that's really good of being a student of your spouse, being a student of your children, so on. Yeah. Jared? Yeah, I have a lot of them, but they're usually um, counseling books. So I'd need to think more specifically about like which one would be good. There's an article on desiring God that I can post on Basecamp that's about this that would be really good. And also the fourth chapter of Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm all about just reading the best chapter of a book and being fine with that. So, Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you could find that on a PDF online. Fourth chapter. It's called Service. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know that I feel that way too. So one thing that I did in one of the harder conversations I've had in the last year was I just actually said, like, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to listen today. And then like we can get together again and I can kind of after praying and thinking I can share some things. One of the things I think people pressure us into is they want us to give our opinion when we probably shouldn't, and so I think it's more reasonable just to say, hey, like let me pray about this stuff, and then like, and I think it also is this ongoing time thing. No issue that, and like maybe not even a hangnail can be solved in one conversation. You know, this is the thing we think that we just don't understand, and that's why I want to talk about this subject is because the truth is that as a church we just have to care for each other with intentionality and skill, and that Sunday morning, how are you doing conversation is a good time to make plans to go have coffee or whatever, but we have to just keep going back and forth. But biggest thing for me on that is a lot of times I feel like I didn't say something, and I'm straight up. Um, the last few years anyway, I've been real careful just to go back to that person and say, "Hey, I thought I should have said this, and I didn't," and so on. And but the big thing that I know you feel is like you're not the fixer, and I feel that too. Like you're not the savior. You're not in this conversation to fix them. You know that there's something deeper that the Lord is doing there, and so fearing under fearing like not performing well is like I fear that I won't have this super insightful thing to say to you that will change your life. It's like, you won't. You can go in knowing that's not going to happen. Yeah. 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 That's so good. Yep. I feel like sometimes I I can remember to do this, but I feel it's really helpful when people have controversial questions. Like, they'll come to you and say, like, do you believe the earth is 10,000 years old or much older? And the right answer in that moment needs to be, what do you think? Like why like, we're going to have this conversation, you're initiating it, you take the first step, you take the risk. But I think, like, people ask about divorce and remarriage, for instance, and I want to know what they think, just because I want to know, like, where is your heart, if they're divorced or something, like, where is your heart leading you in this? Like, I need, like, tell me what you're thinking a little bit. So, yeah, that's really good, Max. Anything else? Let me read this quote and we'll be done. This is from David Mathis, who's quoting Bonhoeffer, that book that I recommended. Here, Bonhoeffer gives us something to avoid: a kind of listening with half an ear that presumes already to know what the other person has to say. This, he says, is an impatient, inattentive listening that is only waiting for a chance to speak. Perhaps we think we know where the speaker is going, and so already begin formulating our response. We're in the middle of something when someone started to talk to us and have another commitment approaching, and we wish we were done already. Um, yeah, so just having just this sense of, I'm all in, both ears, so on. It's huge. All right, well, let me pray for us that God would help us with this. Lord, I just ask that you would do a work that, I think this is, we're asking for a good thing here, that you would, Lord, just help us to be men and women of understanding who help others kind of sort out what's going on, not only in their heart, but in the Lord's heart, in your heart. So I pray that you would just do that work, Father. There's so much to talk about, so many potential directions. But I think if we just keep coming to you week after week and praying and asking, Lord, would you help me be a good communicator? Lord, I think you'll honor that. But Father, I imagine as we talk that there are just, I'm probably not the only one who just feels all of these things about, like, boy, I don't think I do this very well, or I just haven't listened well, or so on and so forth. Father, would you just remind us that, that's what's in our heart, but what's in your heart is that you're a perfect listener and you're faithful and good. And if we repent of being bad listeners and ask you to help us, you will, because that's who you are. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.